Across the world, the far right is on the rise. And across the world, one of the main weapons they are using, possibly the main weapon they are using, is fears of immigration. From Trump's 2016 run, where he slandered Hispanic migrants as rapists, to his 2020 run, where he slandered Haitian migrants as killing and eating people's pets, to reform in the UK, to the ADF in Germany, to the populist right, really all over the liberal democratic world. Mainline parties have had to face a narrative that says the main thing going wrong in their country is too high levels of immigration. And across the world, they have really struggled to counter this. So I thought it might be interesting to engage with some of the more recent political science and social science research on this. My guest today, Dr. Pontus Odmam, is a researcher in this. His work focuses on looking at immigration debates in a comparative context, which I just thought would be really interesting to chat through. One quick note here is we cover the UK debate a fair amount. This was recorded before the latest set of reforms to the refugee system in the UK was announced. So obviously we don't cover that in this episode. But listening to it back, this is still all very, very relevant. This is not a debate that's going away anytime soon. So, yeah, this is the global immigration debate with Dr. Pontus Odmam. Okay, so I am joined today by Pontus Odmam. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Toby.
I'm going to give you a really big question to start, so just take as much time with this one as you want.
Sure.
But I read one of your papers, and I just picked out a single line of, yeah, that's it. Like, that's the reduced sentence. But then obviously that sentence needs a bit of unpacking. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to quote you to you. This is in the context of the European immigration debate. Quote, mainstream parties have found it challenging to come up with consistent narratives, end quote. And I'm like, yeah, that's it. Like, it's not so much the exact... No, I'm going to let you explain it rather than giving my views.
Sure.
Mainstream parties have found it challenging to come up with consistent narratives on immigration, and particularly to come up with consistent narratives on immigration in the face of challenges from the populist right. Explain.
Well, I mean, part of the issue is with the sort of question of immigration itself, right? It's approached and it's seen as a question like any other in politics. So it's seen as it's nothing different. It's no different from taxation or healthcare or education spending. But the problem is that it is quite different from other types of questions in the sense that it attaches itself to all of the areas in public policy, and as such, it becomes very difficult to sort of pinpoint down exactly how do you deal with or engage with immigration. Because it's on one hand, it's an issue of economics, of labor markets. It's also about social policy. It's also about healthcare, about housing, education, what have you. And then there's also this more nebulous dimension to it, which is about national identity and feelings and perceptions of who the we are. So in a sense, migration is everything and nothing at the same time. And then trying to come up with, okay, we're gonna stop immigration, we cut down levels of immigration, becomes problematic because it's not, you can't approach it in the same way as other policy areas just by having a debate and a white paper and then deciding on it, because it cuts across all these different dimensions. on top of that, we also have different categories of migration, right? So it's not just about asylum, but immigration, comes in various shapes and sizes. We're talking about labor migration, skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled, family reunification, student migration, retirement migration, family reunification. So then trying to then sort of say we're going to cut levels of migration doesn't quite work if you look at it on this broad spectrum of different types. Because you might say, well, we're trying to address, the number of asylum seekers coming in, say. But then on the other hand, we also need to have more migration for labor purposes. We also have to think about family reunification from, say, human rights perspective, because that's something that we were signed up as a country. So trying to then come up with a cohesive narrative of one sort of message is very difficult, because we're talking about very different types of migration, very different types of people, reasons for coming, they're coming for, have different sort of backgrounds, they have different experiences, often by migration journey, for example, which makes it very difficult then to think, okay, so this is what we're going to do over the next parliamentary cycle. So that's the sort of problem of narrative. But then you have trying to engage with radical right type parties. And the difference here, I think, is that radical rights, they are very clear. So they want levels to go down across the board. It doesn't really matter what type of migration we're talking about, but they just want numbers to go down. They're obsessed with the numbers in a way. Now, if you're a mainstream party, then you might sort of agree and say, okay, well, we're a bit cautious about migration for labor purposes. We're going to make that a bit more challenging, a bit more difficult. But then we are also, lenient towards particular types of family reunifiers or asylum migration. So they have a sort of mixed bag here between being liberal or more lenient towards some categories and being more restrictive on others. So then the radical right, in a sense, in an excellent position, because they're saying, well, you can't really trust these parties because they're saying one thing and doing another, and they're not having this wholesale approach that we have, which is better to bring down numbers regardless of category. So they got sort of joint, like a two-front type war that they're fighting in a way, trying to come up with a consistent narrative from the type of party that they are. And then trying to come up with a narrative against the radical right, which sort of saying, we want levels to go down regardless. Whereas mainstream parties, well, they sort of can't quite decide which type of category they're focusing on, and then also sort of say that there's a nuance here. There's a different types of migration, and we can't just have a blanket policy on these.
It strikes me that there's two challenges that face, and I'm just talking in general terms here, but I do want to zero in on the UK case at some point in the interview. There's two challenges to the mainstream party in coming up with a counter proposition to the radical right. The first is that mainstream parties, especially if they're in government, are to some degree bound by reality in a way that the far right isn't. Like the far right can just say, we want all forms of immigration to go down. We're not particularly concerned to distinguish, say, asylum from family reunification claims. And we just don't accept that they're trade-offs. We don't accept that any other good might be compromised by that project, that there might be any challenge in enforcement, and everything will just get better. And indeed, the failures to realise immigration restriction projects are taken as evidence of the need for more of them.
Yeah.
So that's the first challenge, is what sometimes gets called post-truth politics, although I dislike that phrase. The second, and I think to maybe bring it to the UK, this is something the Starmer government really struggles with, is I think voters primarily assess politicians and parties through the lens of values. And the far right is able to present a very clear value set. Namely, we believe a homogeneous society is a better one, and we will shape policy around that. The Labour government's, but there's many other centre-left, centre-right parties one could look to in Europe, seems to me to be saying, no, we don't buy that. We believe in pluralism and tolerance. But then we also want numbers to go down because at some level we kind of don't at the same time. It simultaneously believes and doesn't believe. in liberal values. And I think electorates don't find that authentic or compelling.
I think I lost you there slightly. What was the last thing you said?
And I think electorates don't perceive that in many ways correctly,
Mm.
don't perceive that as authentic. They don't perceive them as having sincere values.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, I think what I'm hearing here is sort of the distinction between a sort of an ideologically driven type party or ideologically driven policies and a way of governing that's characterized by sort of competence and delivery. And this has been sort of long-standing sort of issue of conflict in politics. How do you get this balance right between a vision that you want to sell to voters, but also showing that you're competent and they can trust you in delivering what you said you're going to deliver during the elections. So there you definitely have a tension there between what you want and what you can do, what you promise to do, and how that sort of how that matches up to what you actually when people take stock to see, did this party I voted for, did they do what they said they were going to do? And the radical right is in a very in a privileged position here because they can promise a lot and then they don't necessarily get called out on it because so far. When they have been in government, they've been sort of supporting parties in coalitions, and on the odd occasion when they were in government, they got voted out during the next parliamentary cycle. I think that was the case of Austria in the early 2000s. So in a sense, the mainstream party is very difficult then to sort of compete with and sort of claim that. We have this values based, we have this ideology, because they also they're also faced with the reality, like you were saying about, all of a sudden numbers goes up, there's a migration crisis, there's an asylum crisis, and something needs to be done. And most of the time it's very difficult to address these at the short term, or at sort of the firefighting stage. So it takes a bit longer to sort of see the effects of sort of policies and the negotiations with other states and other supernatural institutions. So I guess I slightly disagree with you there. Is that I think both types of parties do put forward this sort of values, this ideology, the type of society that they want to see. The difference, I think, is that the mainstream parties are also constrained a bit by the governing aspect, that they need to perform, they need to sort of show that they've actually produced something, accomplished something, which the radical right so far don't have the same type of demands on them.
No, I mean, obviously it's both. Obviously, people judge parties both by values, I think what you termed their ideology, and sort of concrete deliverables. I guess the critique I was running, I'm thinking particularly here of the Starmer government, is that they've reduced that all to the latter. They have reduced what they imagine their electoral appeal to be to delivering certain tangible results to people. And I guess the performance of competency seems to be quite important to them. But they don't seem to think at all, or at least not in any coherent sort of way, about the values proposition, or put very simply, why are we doing what we're doing? I don't think they have a coherent story that they're telling there, which is why I started with your quote. And I think that really hurts them. I think and there's polling I could cite to back this up. I think if you ask people, what does this government stand for and what does it believe in? The most common response you get is nothing. And that's a problem, and electorates don't respond well to it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. It's I guess the sort of what the Labour government at the moment, they're sort of stuck between, they can't really decide, are they pursuing this values, this vision type approach, or are they trying to play the competence card? And I think with migration issue, right? A lot of the competition has been around which government is better at dealing with it, so delivering results, usually about bringing numbers down. But then you also got this sort of it's not just the numbers need to go down. Sometimes they need to go up in other areas. So we might need particular types of labor migrants to that when numbers should go up. It would also be that certain things are out of control of the national government. For example, you can't really control the number of people seeking asylum in a way, because that very much depends on what happens in the rest of the world. So I think that they're stuck here between two things here, which they're struggling with, and this is the type of society that Labour wants to create, or that they have in mind for the next parliamentary cycle. And then you got this sort of leftover or the hangover of previous elections, where it was very much about which party is better at dealing with these issues. And the reason for that, the reason why you get sort of competence type competition is that parties agree on the outcome. So they all want a growth economy that grows, but they differ on how to get the economy to grow. Then it's less about sort of agreeing on the outcome and differing on the terms to get there, but it's very much disagreeing on the outcome. And I think Labour hasn't quite decided, what type of outcome they have in mind. They seem to suggest a lot of things, but it's not very concrete, right? So I think that's maybe that voters are a bit confused or a bit disillusioned, and that's why the appeal of the radical right is so much stronger now. It's because they got a very clear vision, they got a very clear idea what type of society that they want. Whereas the mainstream parties aren't quite able to formulate that vision or that idea or that type of values that they see at the end stage of the journey.
What's your analysis of how long have Labour been in office? It's only a year and a bit, isn't it? What's your, and I could cite various polling of Reform have an 11-point lead, or the government's approval is like 10% or something. Now, obviously that's not only immigration, but that has been an issue that's dominated our political conversation recently and for some time now. There's a few others we could mention, certainly the economy. What's your analysis of why, coming in with a very large majority, albeit on a small share of the popular vote, but it's seats that matter, and they came in with a very large majority, and accepting that it's normal for parties to slump a bit in the polls midterms, but not this. Like, what's your analysis of why why this is not working?
Good question. There's different takes out there, and one it's which is sort of one very strong argument is about trying to out radical right the radical right, right? Which is
right.
Do, because once you start going down that path, the radical right always leapfrogs you and gets it. Well, we're gonna up you one on that one or two. We're gonna make it even more difficult, even more draconian policies. So then you sort of get into this doom loop where you're sort of constantly trying to catch up with the radical right, and it's very difficult to do. Like we talked about before, they don't have the same constraints, the same type of same sort of checks that they need to show that they've done what they said they were going to do. They're not really that bothered about that, whereas mainstream parties are. So it's difficult to constantly be one step ahead of the radical right, and so it's very difficult to catch up with them. I think that's one part of one part of the answer. The other one is it's about sort of the general sort of world mood about the sort of overall shift towards the authoritarian right. So it's become a lot more. It's not just sort of the odd instance, but it seems to be sort of a pattern, a sort of overall shift in that direction. And again, so this goes back to, well, which party do you then trust to deliver on this authoritarian vision? Well, it's probably not the mainstream party, but it's the one on the fringe, or the one that's more extreme, that you will then support or they will vote for. And that's what comes back to the difficulties mainstream parties have, because, well, how do you then profile yourself against the original, as it were? You need to come up with something that is not just a copy or a facsimile, but something that is different, that provides some sort of choice between you as a mainstream party and the radical right. So I think that's sort of where we are at the moment, and this is sort of what my sort of niche research sort of looks at, about how do mainstream parties engage in the politics of migration? How do they negotiate these very difficult trade-offs between the sort of the former niche contender, because now it's become one of the main contenders. And at the same time, they have to juggle all these other economic crises, the cost of living crisis, the very strange ongoings in U.S. politics, which is very unpredictable. It changes from hour to hour. So layering that on top of the migration issue, which is one of those weird things, which is sort of a container issue that you can put all your various grievances in. So then that sort of makes it very difficult for mainstream parties to address these so-called genuine concerns of voters, right? Because it's immigration taps into every type of concern that people have, and it also can be blamed on all of these concerns that people have. And just sort of saying, well, if we just reduced, got rid of migrants, we've got the limits down to zero, we've got remigration going on, then everything would be solved. Now, the problem there is that it might not necessarily be because of these migration levels. It could be because of underfunding. It could be because of the global market forces that are affecting the supply and demand, for example. So it will be very difficult for a party to say, okay, well, we'll reduce the number of migrants, and then the positive change to the voters are expecting might not necessarily happen, because there's something sort of beyond, there's a structural force beyond the control of parties and of nation states that are sort of influencing the day-to-day life. But because immigration is very sort of tangible, it's very something that you can sort of point to and sort of blame, then it becomes sort of the solution or the way to sort of where the blame can be allocated towards.
Why do you think we are seeing a sort of rising far right across the board? You've mentioned these concerns aren't necessarily tethered to actual immigration levels, but nonetheless, across Europe, UK, US, you're seeing a much stronger rise of populist right parties. Do you have any sense of what is causing that?
Again, there's the different explanations going on here. I mean, one that's sort of been done by colleagues of mine is to look at the both the perceived insecurity of voters and the actual sort of material insecurity that they are facing, and that's a very sort of material type explanation, where we have competition versus competition about jobs, and also the sort of instability of your working life. So you don't really have a job for life, but you have might have several different jobs. So you jump between them over time, and that leads to a sense of a grievance that needs to be addressed in some way. And radical right parties are very good at picking up on this and then allocating the blame on the nebulous group of migrants. But then you also got the slightly more sort of post-material angle to it, which is about the sort of resurgence of nationalist feelings, and it's about this sort of boundary making between in groups and out groups. And again, I would say this is much trickier for mainstream parties in particular to address, because it's about sort of feelings and emotions, and about identity and identification. So it's difficult to sort of formulate policies on national identity. How strongly do you feel attached to your country, and how can we improve this by formulating specific policies? Much more difficult than having these sort of material sort of economic type issues, which is about, okay, now our aim is to improve education levels. So aim is to train more apprentices in these type of areas. But once you're talking about sort of emotions and feelings and sense of self and who you are, and relating that to migration, then it becomes very difficult to sort of formulate that into something practical. Now, again, the radical right is very is very clear on this, and it's about, it's a very clear borders between who belongs and who doesn't. Whereas the mainstream parties are sort of say, well, how did you find who's got legitimate access to the sort of goodies of the state? Well, it could be based on residence, it could be based on what visa you have, it could be based on nationality, and so forth. Whereas the radical right is very clear. Well, either you're in or you're out. And we got very strict and rigid criteria for belonging. So that makes it provides voters, I guess, with a very sort of clear black and white either or type view of the world.
My view would be, and I'm not saying it's easy, but I am saying a lot of centre left and centre right parties don't really seem to have attempted it. That, yeah, it's that latter domain on which the far right needs to be challenged. Like, in terms of feelings of belonging and identity. Yeah, you can't directly speak. You can only at best indirectly speak to that through policy. You need a different story. You need to have a different account of this is what it means to be British or French or Italian. This is what it means to belong. And that being a part of our society isn't about race or even perhaps where you were born. And there's various things liberals have filled that gap with. You can say there's a shared vision of freedom and pluralism.
Yep.
You can say that there's customs and traditions. There's all sorts of things you can draw to, but you need to put something that contrasts with their story. And I'm not saying it's always easy to do that, but I am a little concerned to the extent to which it doesn't seem to have been attempted at all.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think I slightly disagree with you there. I mean, I think it's been attempted in various ways, but perhaps not the most efficient or the most sort of logical ways. I mean, one, and mainly is that it's been directed primarily at newcomers, at migrants trying to come into British society in this case, but also elsewhere. It's been about these sort of integration tests, for example. And the citizenship test is one example of this, where you read a book and then you go through a multiple choice questionnaire, and then you need to pass this test, and then that is seen as, okay, that's enough. Now you've proved to us that you're a potential citizen, and that you sort of signed this contract. Now the problem, I guess, with having those types of tests is that it's almost by definition very sort of vague, almost like a Netflixization of British identity. So it's based on, on stereotypes, and it's based on particular images or particular ideals, which might not, have much to do with reality. But that's sort of one aspect of it, was states.
But I would say that falls into exactly the trap I was outlining of trying to use policy to address a values vision. You're not challenging. The right says, oh, we need this cohesive national set of values, and immigrants are a threat to that. And so you try and address that by accepting the premise that we need a cohesive national set of values and that immigrants are a threat to that. And then saying, oh, well, maybe if we made the immigrants do all these tests, as opposed to saying that's not what defines the type of country we want to live in. That what defines the type of country we want to live in are people free and prosperous and happy and healthy, not by does everyone watch Coronation Street? Like, I think you have to draw that, and that's what maybe there's parties in Europe we could look to. That's what I get frustrated that I haven't seen the Labour Party do.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure there are any other parties are doing something different. I think that they are all sort of facing in that direction, and they're sort of gone further. Some have gone further than others, but I think that the sort of general shift is to try and come up with, this sort of template or redefinition of what does it mean to be nationality X, right? And then how do you then try to make policy out of that? How do you go around, how we go about testing, potential citizens, potential members of the society, that you are actually a potential member. So I think that's been going on, and I'm not really sure that other states are trying to come up with or be trying to do this sort of counter narrative. I think what's happened in the past, you had sort of different approaches. You had sort of very sort of state heavy-handed state intervention, perhaps, in terms of, okay, this is sort of a practical list of things you need to know in order to thrive in the new society. And that was sort of almost like an assimilation type approach to this is what we expect from you, and this is what you should do, and we don't really acknowledge, the difference in the public sphere, but we expect everyone to sort of conform to these types of behaviors. Then you had other approaches sort of say, well, it's important that the public sphere is sort of neutral, and we have sort of one common language, but we also recognize the importance of people speaking different languages, and the importance of having other cultures surviving within a sort of a dominant cultural narrative. That was sort of all fine. I think the problem now is we're almost like coming back to, what does it mean to belong? What does it mean to be a citizen? What can we ask of migrants when they arrive? Are there any limits to, say, multiculturalism? Are there any limits to what we can sort of ask of migrants before we sort of overreach, certain, say, human rights conventions or international treaties or liberal values, for example? What can we legitimately ask as a state of people to do, which sort of goes beyond perhaps what we're asking the rest of the population?
One narrative I'm sort of surprised, not surprised, but like that the government hasn't gone for is the foreign nature itself of much of the populist right. So, you had Elon Musk speaking, I mean, via remote link.
Yeah.
At the big rally we had in London, a lot of the funding for reform affiliated groups comes from the States, and it's increasingly being alleged Russia. Um, I feel like I feel like I'd almost want to stress that these are foreign authoritarians who are trying to disrupt how British society and politics is run. And you saw a little bit of that at the Labour Party conference, but there's definitely a timidity about taking that attack line, which would seem to me to be a very obvious attack line, because you're not just pointing out something potentially nefarious, you're pointing out something potentially hypocritical on their part, in that, Nigel Farage claims to be Britain for British people and self-rule and so on, but is in reality funded by and almost entirely subservient to foreign money.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the sort of tricks that the radical right has pulled off in a way. I mean, on one hand, the populist element of them is that they've been able to portray, especially the leaders, that they are sort of part of the people, they represent the people, and they come, usually they come from a very privileged background, so don't really resemble the voters they're claiming to represent. But then you got, and this is an interesting development, is the internationalization of the radical right.
Yeah.
Moved away from the nation-specific or nation-centric type radical rights, which saw other groups as being, as threatening the sovereignty, perhaps as being antagonists. And now they're sort of unified. It's almost like the internationalization of the radical rights, by sort of saying, well, actually, we're talking about, it's the fight for the survival of the white race, right? It's about we need to unify in order to address our common problem. So we have something in common, which is about the Islamification, say, or it's the taking over of our respective states by the foreign other. But if we group together, then we can collectively address these issues, which we can't do on our own, right? So here they're sort of turning the narrative around slightly, sort of saying, well, we are nationalists. We believe in, the nation, the primacy of the nation. We believe that we all got our, cultural specificities, but we are united here is about the racial element that sort of connects us, And this is that's why you can see all of these links developing between with different far right and radical right groups that sort of picking up on the commonalities they share and trying to exchange information about sort of what works and what doesn't, and they coordinate a lot more than they did in the past. So that's a sort of an interesting way. That's how they've dealt with this tension, I guess, that you were alluding to about the sort of nationalist focus, but then also having these international links. And I guess what's sort of unifying here is that you all have this sort of sense of racial challenge, right? So it's the replacement theory that comes in here. Is about the white people becoming a minority, and that's sort of shared across all these different countries.
Do you think mainline parties? I mean, I think that's all exactly right. I think what you're seeing across the world is a case of convergence. I think sometimes people can talk as if a rising far right is simply a force of nature and that it's inevitable, and there's just some deep will of the Volk that's rejecting liberalism and democracy. But it's a set of ideas like any other, and it's also nothing new. You saw, like in the rise of original mid-20th century fascism, they shared ideas and they took notes from each other. Certainly in the rise of socialism, they were all like taking ideas and notes from each other across countries. And this was before the internet, of course. Um, so it doesn't seem to me to be that wild an idea that what we're sort of seeing is convergence. You know, Brexit and Trump had different historic pathways in, but then the movements that came out of them have been very influenced by each other. Certainly, we're all influenced by American culture. Do you share my feeling that, let's just take Labour, and perhaps just liberalism in the UK generally, has not done a very good job of pointing this out to people? That this is what we're dealing with here is the same force as gave America Trump and Musk. Like that this is all interconnected. Because I don't think most British people see it that way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think it's you can see those types of voices here and there, but I don't think they've been very good at. I mean, it goes back to the cohesive narrative discussion we had earlier. It's about sort of seeing the almost like bird's eye view of what's going on, sort of the bigger picture here. It's not about isolated events. So Trump is not one thing that happens in the US, but it's a symptom of a larger thing that's happening in many different places. And then you've got this sort of feedback loop between different actors learning from each other, saying what worked here. We'll try to be a bit more extreme in the next, say, European Parliament election, the next local election. See how does that pay off? Okay, great, it did. Now let's do that again somewhere else. This type of the post-truth making stuff up narratives that goes on in the US at the moment. How does that work if we bring it into the next general election in the UK? Can we get away with these types of narratives there? So there's a lot of those discussions going on. Probably what I'm trying to sort of see. Okay, can we're not sort of going to go from one extreme to the other just yet. But we're sort of gradually pushing the envelope as we're gradually saying more and more sort of extreme things to see if we can get away with it.
One counterexample to this trend of like not because I'm not I'm not any type of academic, but to the extent I'm tuned in, I'm much more on the political theory side. So I'm very much obviously going to look at like values and narratives. One potential counterexample would be we're both in Edinburgh and the Scottish National Party. I mean, Swinney gave, I thought, a reasonably good speech the other week where he said, our flag is a flag of welcome, refugees are welcome here, and did this great thing about if you've ever gone through the NHS, you have been treated by migrants. Your friends, your family owe their lives in a very literal sense to migrants. And it wasn't anything massive and flashy, but I do remember thinking, yeah, this is what I'm saying I'd like our leaders to be doing, is giving a different vision, as opposed to saying, yes, we agree that refugees are bad.
Mm.
but we're more competent than Farage is to implement control measures to
Mm.
say refugees are good for countries. Just like let's have a different starting point. Do you
Mm.
have any sense of why the SNP has taken such, or what has enabled the SNP to take such a different track?
But I guess
Because
there's just two things there. I mean, one is it's the Scotland is different from the rest of the UK sort of narrative, and this is how things are done here and then done better in the rest of the UK. The second, perhaps more important one, is that immigration is a reserved matter. So, a lot of the Scottish parties, the Scottish Parliament can say and ask and demand a lot of things, but they don't really have control over that. They don't have control over who comes in. They don't have control over who gets the refugee status. They don't have control over work visas and so forth. So, in a sense, they can be, very much on the other side of the debates, but not really how to then face the consequences of this, say, in a sort of post-independence era. Um, um, and then I guess the other thing to point out here is that if we're looking at some of the attitudes on the population, there's a lot of talk about whether the population of Scotland is different from the rest of the UK, and I think there was some interesting stats that came out from the Migration Policy Institute just a few days ago, when they looked at the slightly sort of shifting in tone within the Scottish population, is that they're still largely migrant friendly, largely asylum friendly. I think migration is a good thing, but it's become slightly less than it used to be. So it sort of cooled down a bit. The sort of the gap between the rest of the UK is not as big anymore. I think the big difference perhaps is between the elite type of discourse that you mentioned in Scotland and down in Westminster, which is very like night and day. It reminds me of some of the discussions that were around in the 2005 election, where immigration was overall a good thing, and there was not really any ceiling towards how many people could come in for, say, labour purposes, and it was the UK's responsibility as a world actor to welcome asylum seekers and so forth. That's obviously changed, but I think it's sort of still that type of discourse and that type of framing is still around in Scottish politics.
one debate I've been a part of is there's a loosely defined group of centrists, which me and others have taken to calling reactionary centrists, whose general view, and this is the case in both the US and the UK, is that the median voter is pretty skeptical, if not outright hostile to immigration, and thinks there's too much of it. And so, for a centre left party to win elections, they simply have to give policy ground on that.
Yeah.
Now, my first response to that is, well, it hasn't worked, has it, in the case of Labour and their popularity or lack thereof? But I think there's sort of this other issue that we often end up debating is the reactionary centrist, as I call them, seems to imagine that the median voter is utterly unpersuadable. That there's no other set of arguments or values that you could appeal to that might move them. And I think our response, our here meaning, I don't know, progressive
Yeah.
liberals, is of course people are persuadable. The median voter thinks what they think because of, at this point, 20 years of very, very hostile press coverage of this issue. If they were exposed to different stories, at least some of them might move. Like, people hold all sorts of eclectic and half-formed thoughts, right? They are movable. Um, let me just ask, do you have a side on that? Do you think there could be a shift in attitudes if the roughly half of the country who don't feel hostility towards immigrants were louder or had more voice in the press or had one of the main parties, excluding, I guess, the SNP,
Mm.
more vociferously championing that word them.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question again. I mean, I think that sort of taps into something called elite cues in political science language, which is about it's important what leaders and parties say because it will tend to trickle down and get picked up by the rest of the population. So you can see these if the overall narrative is Scotland say is a welcoming country or the UK is a welcoming country at an immigration, on average is a good thing for various reasons, then that might sort of help to sway the median voter that you were talking about. And then conversely, if we have the opposite type of narrative, the immigration is a drain on resources, it's a challenge, it's a threat to national identity, then that will shift opinion in a different direction. But then you also got the question of are parties simply following public opinion, right? Are they just going where they think that the public is going, sort of thinking about the median voter and trying to plan ahead for that, or they're trying to lead public opinion, or they're trying to sort of bring back visions about this is the type of country society that we want, and these are the reasons for this. Rather than talking about sort of competence and delivery and trying to it's almost sort of showing a bit of an integrity, perhaps, in terms of who you are as a party, trying to sort of lead rather than follow.
What would you advise Labour to do? Sweeney's out, Pontus is
Uh,
in.
yeah,
What's your strategy?
uh, I don't know. I mean, I think the language, language is very, very important, and trying not to confuse different categories of migration, for example. So if you're talking about asylum seekers, don't call them refugees because they haven't been granted that status yet. Talk about clandestine or unauthorized migration rather than illegal. Differentiate between different categories of migration, and also don't immediately fall for the radical right siren call. Right, there's a possibility of saying, coming up with a different narrative, or coming up with,
Yeah.
going back to the roots of who we are as a party. I think this applies to the Conservative Party as well. If you go back to the origins of these parties and the sort of the core values, then this fits very well with a type of positive migration narrative. Both from the left and the right, even though both parties are also they experience tensions and contradictions because of who they are as a party. But it's also possible to make that sort of slightly more positive, progressive case from both the left and the right.
I mean, it's interesting, you mentioned the Conservatives. We've just had a fairly detailed conversation about UK politics for an hour, and
Mm.
not once has it seemed relevant to bring them up.
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe that's a sign of the times. So looking at the party conference they're having at the moment, and the sort of the slump in support and the way that reform is sort of sucking up these types of voters. But I think what's interesting with the Conservatives, on the one hand, they should be very much in favor of a particular type of migrants, I'm thinking Labour migrants in particular, because of the free market nature of the party. They quite like the market forces to have a greater say in the state. And labor migration is great in many ways because it keeps wage inflation low, it fills positions and so forth. So you could, if conservatives were sort of to pick up on that narrative, which is very natural to who they are as a party, then that's one way for them to change the narrative here, rather than sort of move it towards issues of national identity and social cohesion and how immigration sort of threatens ways of life, which is also a strand of conservative parties.
Let me ask you this before we go, because this is another element to it, is what the hell happened to the centre right? And this is perhaps answer it in a global context, because one of the sort of challenges or questions I get a lot is, why has liberalism failed? And I
Mm.
think, just as a starting point, a response to that is depends what you mean by liberalism. But if you mean a
Mm.
sort of mainline progressive, pro-LGBT, pro-environment, softly pro-immigration, pro-liberal democracy, right? That hasn't gone away.
mm,
That's still, if anything, perhaps in the face of global threats,
mm,
somewhat more subscribed to than it was, say, 10 years ago. Now, in the UK, that's oddly fractured between parties. You've got
mm,
Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, and so on. But even with our slightly strange party system, it's still there. There's still a core vote to the Democrats. There's still, and is it a majority of those societies? No, but it's there. Whereas
mm,
it seems like a sort of like small c conservative respect for institutions
mm,
and traditions, free market,
yeah,
that whole thing, but not screaming from the rooftops type.
mm,
That's just disappeared completely. And it's I think people can sometimes think liberalism's failed and fascism has screamed
mm,
into the void. But I'd almost challenge you to say, no, the centre right has failed and fascism has screamed into the
mm,
void. I don't know if you have any sense, because that is definitely international. You're seeing that everywhere, that there just isn't a small c conservative force anywhere really
mm.
anymore. I don't know if you have any sense of why that is, because I must admit, other than people just stopped believing in it, but then that just pushes the question back to why.
Yeah, but I
Why? Yeah, go ahead.
sorry. So I think saying liberalism has failed or liberalism has died. I think that might be exaggerating things slightly because the the facets to liberalism. I think the maybe the
Oh,
sort of
I agree
the
completely.
neoliberal sort of type globalization liberalism that was sort of seen as the well that had sort of won at the end of the Cold War. That is probably taking a back seat now. And then you've got the
Mhm.
social liberal tradition, which is being probably challenged a bit now because of the way the pendulum has swung slightly on the sort of like diversity of lifestyles type questions. So becoming a bit more um, traditional values orientated. So that's sort of gaining a bit of ground again, and it's a very difficult to be different in a way.
Mm.
But it's the homogenization of societies that has been made a bit of a return. So I don't think liberalism has failed. I guess it's the spark or the flame has gone down significantly to where it was, say, just before the financial crisis. I think because that's what
No,
had.
no, I agree liberalism hasn't failed, and we're
Mm,
sort of we're almost now in the reactive position. Liberals are
mm,
now, as opposed to charting new ground, we're
yeah,
as Americans call themselves, the resistance. My
mm,
question was more, what the hell's happened to the centre right globally? There is no such thing as an anti-Trump or a moderate Republican anymore at all.
mm,
And, the Conservative Party in the UK, despite a very unpopular Labour government, and
mm,
still officially, apparently, the opposition is polling at 13 to
mm.
15%. What happened to that slice of our politics?
Yeah, I mean that's really good question. I mean, one answer to this might be to think of political life as sort of at least two dimensions. You got this sort of economic, and you got the values.
Hmm.
And then for several decades, the emphasis was on economic questions in different ways, and it was very clear what type of choices you had between the left and the right.
Hmm.
But then when you get the values dimension on top of this, then it becomes much more muddied picture because you can have a free marketeer party who's very socially conservative, and that means that they've got different views on the state, conflicting views on the state. State should either butt out of the economy or be very much engaged and interventionist in this sort of personal sphere. So then if you are a party who's just been going in one sort of bring taxes down, let the market forces rip, and then have to then think about these other types of questions as well, then it becomes very difficult for you to come up with the cohesive narrative again. And I guess for the radical right, because they want more states in both dimensions, right? So they want more influence in the economy, but also in the sort of personal sphere. Then then this view of the state corresponds. So don't have these tensions or strains that some of the mainstream parties have. So I think with the conservative, so the centre right. I mean, I don't have a sort of a sort of quick answer to that, apart from that trying to play catch up with radical right doesn't work. It doesn't work for center left parties. It doesn't work for center right parties. And maybe they spend too much time talking about these sort of values issues, which is not sort of the main strength, and they should have sort of stuck with the economic side of the coin. So I think they've sort of gone outside of their comfort zone, and that has sort of created a backlash to them because they're not very comfortable talking about these questions, which the radical right sort of says, yes, we got a very clear idea of what a man is or a woman is or what a relationship looks like or who belongs and who doesn't. And
Yeah,
then
I think, yeah, no, go ahead, Si.
no, that was the full stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in the UK case,
Mm,
is they've spent decades feeding the wolf and are now surprised that it's eating them. Is you can go back to Cameron, David Cameron running on, we're going to reduce immigration to 20,000 a year,
mm,
which is a number that is obviously incompatible with European Union membership. And yet they ran on it. They ran on this idea that, like, oh, immigrants are somehow like this is what's going wrong with the country and we need to talk about it.
mm,
Um and yeah, and they fed the narrative that like the main thing that we need to do is cut immigration numbers
mm.
while making promises that they knew they couldn't deliver
Yeah.
on that front. And then voters were finally like, okay, so we've heard for 20 years that we need to bring numbers down and you haven't done it. So we'll empower the people who seem crazy enough to really push the envelope on that. Like they did it to themselves in a lot of ways.
Mm. Yeah, but I think you're right there. I think that the danger with coming up or setting targets is that you can never reach them, right?
Mm,
In a sense, they're arbitrary, and that's one problem. And then it's the nature of immigration, like we're talking about initially. It's not just one category, but several categories. So it's very difficult to bring these down to a set limit. You're setting you up to fail, right? And then this is an open goal for the radical right, saying you can't trust these guys. They promise you they're going to bring down numbers. They promise to bring in caps, all these changes. You can't trust them, and they always fail. And it's part of the plan, right? There's conspiracy theories involved here as well. But if you vote for us, we've got a very clear very clear vision here, and our policy is basically repatriation. That's where we are now. Rather than trying to bring the net zero. It's about having a getting people to leave, repatriating people. So I think definitely, yes, I think the conservatives, they have I think sort of the changing language, which started a few decades ago, about are you thinking what we are thinking, and these little test balloons, and then not following through, then left this gap for the radical right to fill in, to rush in and say, well, actually, we will sort this out. You can trust us. And this is maybe part of the explanation for why the center right is now having this very difficult time.
yeah. On the one hand, I have very little sympathy for them. They made the bed. But then on the other hand, we all have to lie in it.
Mm,
And like, I can see that there is a structural need for like a centre-right force of society that, not everyone's always going to be a liberal, that there is
mm,
a sane conservative party for
yeah.
people to vote to that I might disagree with on all sorts of things, but aren't going to destroy the country.
Mm.
So on the one hand, they did it to themselves, enjoy your 13% polling. On the other, like, their decline is all of our decline as well.
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think what I'm hearing here is not the death of the mainstream, but the seriously challenged mainstream. But it used to be that you had fairly clear idea what these parties stood for and what they agreed on, and it wasn't sort of the anti-system, the disruptiveness that maybe we see in the US politics at the moment. and which might happen if reform wins the next election. Right? They're probably going to go very quick on any changes that they introduce. So I sort of mourn the time where politics was so predictable, and that you can have fairly clear idea of what parties wanted and what they sort of stood for and what they sort of cherished. And it was not this sort of dismantling of the state. It could be very significant changes, but there were certain institutions that will still be there. There will be sort of some continuity. And I think that's a really important thing to flag up. Is we're so in this sort of critical juncture where we're sort of moving perhaps away from this sort of stability, predictability of politics, and the sort of use of institutions in ways that are counterintuitive, that you wouldn't expect them to be used, that they use in a different way.
I think that's the challenge for people on my side who want to draw a clear values distinction with the far right. That part is obvious to me. I think we need to be saying this is their values and this is ours, and our values stand opposed to theirs. That seems pretty not straightforward to execute, but in principle, that's what we need to be doing. I think the challenge for us is when we say what our values are, how do we, to what extent are those the values of continuity, or the values of reform, or even the values a la, Corbyn or Bernie Sanders of a revolution, right? Is on the one hand, there are aspects of, liberal human rights that I certainly want continuity with. On the other, liberalism cannot be seen simply as a force of the status quo, because most people believe, for a variety of quite valid reasons, that the status quo has failed them. So I think I don't have an answer to it. I'll pass it to you if you do, but not just the values question, but how the values square with this sort of stability versus reform axis.
Oh yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, I think I guess it's difficult to know, right? But what we sort of know, two good examples is what's going on in the US at the moment and in Argentina as well. We have very dramatic changes in a very short period of time. And we're still sort of waiting to see how that pans out, what the effects of these changes are. And I think it's not going according to plan in Argentina. And it might not be going according to plan in the US either, with the Department of Governmental Efficiency and so forth. So, I mean, it's tricky, because on one hand, I mean, it goes back to these tensions I was talking about. So if you want to change, but then you also want certain things to stay the same, right? So you need to make reforms, but you don't need to make revolutions. You don't want to destroy institutions, but you want them to adapt, perhaps, to work better or be more fit for purpose. You need to change the way they work in light of the changing world and the changing sort of economic and working order that we have. So it's a tension here, I think, between how do you change while also keeping things the same.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I ask you because I haven't come up with a great answer to it myself. I'm almost just listening to you talk. I'm almost tempted to say the liberal message should be something like human rights and freedoms, we want to stay the same. Structures, like overarching economic and political structures, we need to be open to reforming. Like trying to make some sort of separation like that, to say, the thing we want to defend from the far right is like living in a free and open society, right? That's our continuity. But like the various like institutions that have sort of been built up around that, they're going to have to change. We agree. They might have been good once. They're no longer serving their purpose, and we need to be willing to radically rethink how we structure markets or how we structure governance and so on, because people have lost their trust in these things. I don't know. That's purely me spitballing. It sounds like we both recognize the tension, but are not.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting as well is to look at, is because I guess what sort of when we're talking here, we sort of assume that people want freedom, people want to have have control of their lives. But they could also be, looking at some of the polls now, they're saying, well, authoritarianism is not that all the bad, right?
Hmm.
I would say, well, I'm happy for the state to have more control in my day-to-day life, as long as it creates sort of stability, as long as it provides me with a job.
Hmm.
Then you got this sort of weird situation where, well, as a party, then you're going to go against what the public wants. What the public would say, well, we had enough of this liberal hegemony and liberal world order. Now we want a bit of a strong leader who who delivers and just sorts things out.
Hmm.
And that's obviously a very difficult thing. How do you then adapt to that by doing the sort of similar things, or do you stick to your guns and say, actually, no, we need the pluralistic order. We need to have a change of government. Once every 5 years, free, fair, and open elections. And there's certain sort of fundamentals that we value that provide some continuity. That is a sign of progress. So if you come up with a clash there with a public who doesn't really care about that, they just care about having a job or lower taxes, then it becomes very, very difficult then to carve out the niche for yourselves there as a party. Given that the populist radical right is becoming more of an authoritarian type force than it was before.
I mean, obviously, my view would be you have to stick with your guns. And I think you see this in the US, though, as the country slides into authoritarianism. I'll make a prediction. I think the UK is going to get more authoritarian, but I'll also make a prediction that as you see that, you won't see a commitment to these mainline liberal views just sort of wither away in the same way that you haven't with Trump. There's been a very aggressive, like the Democratic base loathe Trump and they want their leadership to fight him even harder than they perceive him as doing. Right. I think in the UK, we haven't connected the dots to an international movement. The danger isn't real to us yet. You haven't seen that. Although you did a tiny bit with opposition to Brexit. But certainly if we become more authoritarian, you'll see that. And so I think the question just becomes like, that's going to be the team. How do you lead it effectively? You may win or you may not, but like there's going to be a demand for an assertive liberalism. How are we going to be placed to meet that demand? I think will be the question.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge question, which I don't have a simple answer to, or possibly even a answer to that. But I think just sort of going with the stuff that I do know, it's it's a lot of sort of very huge structural changes that have been happening, since the turn of the millennium, which was very much challenged sort of old truths about how politics work. So all these sort of predictions that we could, with a fair amount of certainty, make are very, very difficult to do today in terms of polling and who's going to win the next election. So it's becoming much more difficult to do that. So I think if you are a party that is trying to push the sort of social liberal position, then you're facing a number of obstacles here, right? Especially now, I think you sort of alluded to that earlier. That it's a minority position now, almost. It's better for individuals to have to decide their own life than the state is. That seems to be not the sort of consensus anymore. It's more about sort of the state knows what's best, and people seem to accept that. It's time for that type of radical change. So obviously, if you're a mainstream party and operating within the mainstream parameters, then what can you possibly do here, right? It's very difficult to maybe stick to your guns there, because you need to also have the survival instincts. You need to not be obliterated in the next election, which I think it's a existential crisis for some parties. Or do you try then to sort of accommodate and play catch up with these, and try to sort of water these proposals down a bit, so they're not as authoritarian or as extreme as the radical right proposes?
Which way do you come down?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I am I'm a bit sort of glass half full, half empty at the moment. I'm seeing there's a lot of sort of creeping authoritarianism, a lot of sort of slight small day-to-day infringes on personal liberties, like we have the the right to protest, for example, is being infringed upon. Mm-hmm. It's a cracking down of dissent. But I think what's interesting, forward slash terrifying, is that these changes they either they happen very gradually, so you don't really pay attention to them until you sort of look in retrospect, or like in the US or in Argentina, they happen very quickly in a short period of time, so people are sort of shocked and taken aback and don't really know how to respond. And then once you realize that something needs to be done, that it's potentially too late to do something, or that you can't actually do anything without some severe repercussions.
Yeah. On that cheerful note, let's pause it there. Anywhere you'd like to direct listeners, either your social media, anything like that, or any other resources on this that you think might be interesting to them?
Yeah, no, we're very, very, very happy for people to follow me on Blue Sky in particular. I think it's I forgot my handle.
I think it's just your name, isn't it?
Yeah. It's Podmel at Blue Sky Social, where I post talk about new publications and new research, and also do some minor commentary on recent events. But also link that to my university webpage, where I do have some publications aimed at the sort of lay audience, rather than these heavy academic stuff. So there's might be something interesting there for people to look at, especially regarding some of these tensions that affect mainstream parties in particular.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.